in the family, all the questions about faith and church and religion come to you. And my family was no different. I remember when my sister-in-law was going through RCIA to become Catholic, if my phone rang on a Thursday night about 9:30, it would be her, and she would ask me something that she had heard in class, and I'd give her the answer, and then I'd hear her smack my brother because she had asked him something and he made it up. And she said, I said, well, call me first. And my dad would do that a lot too, want to talk about the gospel that he heard going to Mass that morning. If I was home on a Sunday night for dinner, or when I lived farther away, often we'd call on a Sunday. And he'd always want to talk on this Sunday of the year when this gospel was read. Yeah, me too. Maybe not for the same reason. He'd always be waiting for me, and I always knew what he was going to say. I don't like that gospel reading. I said, it doesn't really matter, Dad, if you like it or not. I don't like it because it's not fair. Right? These guys worked hard all day long, and the guys that just stood around lazy, they got the same pay. That's not fair. I said, well, Dad, obviously it's not about money. It's about eternal life. So it really doesn't have to be fair. He said, it's not fair. I don't like it. I'll take everything else that the Lord had to say, but I don't like this gospel. Now, my father passed away a few months ago in March. After battling cancer for 3 years. And so the last time this came up, he had been doing chemotherapy for about 4 months. And I was home with my family that weekend and was able to celebrate Mass for him and my mom. And when I started to read this gospel, I kind of glanced in his direction and he made a face. And I was waiting for it after Mass. He said, I don't like that gospel. I said, well, Dad, you're a little closer than you thought you were to being in line for your reward. Doesn't that change anything? And he thought about it for a minute. He said, I guess so. I still don't like it, though. The prophet says in the first reading today how important it is to change our minds, to think that the way the Lord thinks. And it's not easy. Isaiah is honest about it. The Lord speaks to us through Isaiah and says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. In fact, if you want to know the difference between the way I think and the way you think about the distance between heaven and earth. My thoughts are different from yours by that much and more. And all of us have some part of sacred scripture or some part of the catechism or one of the commandments or maybe more than one of the commandments that we'd like to argue with the Lord about. That we look and say, I don't like that part. Maybe it's because we've gotten into habits that we find kind of soothing and we don't want to break. Or maybe it's because someone in our life is just difficult to deal with and we don't want to apply the Lord's words to that particular relationship. Or maybe it's just because of the scar of original sin that makes us prideful and makes us want to do our own thing, have our own way, accomplished by our own strength, rather than listen to the Lord. But here's the thing. If you see two people in an argument, and one of them is human and the other is divine, one of them is a creature and the other is the creator, who do you think's going to win every time? And so to be disciples is to, as St. Paul says in another place, put on the mind of Christ. Think like the Lord thinks. It's not easy because his thoughts are quite different from ours. But that's why he sends his Son to us. Jesus tells us in the parables, in his word, in the way that he lives, in the way that he dies, he tells us who God is and what kind of a relationship God our Father wants to have from us. That's what Jesus means when he talks about the kingdom of heaven. Not a place, not a country, but a relationship with God so that God is our King, so that we live as if that is true, so that we give our whole selves to him. So when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like this landowner, what he's saying is, this is what your Father in heaven is like, and this is what he wants from you. And so we have to let the Lord change our hearts and change our minds. Because most of our problems come from forgetting that God means what he says when he says who he is. And if we know who he is, and we know what he's like, and we live like we know it, then everything changes. So what is Jesus telling us in the gospel today about this landowner who is in the story to teach us about God the Father? Well, first of all, God is omnipotent. We owe him our obedience. Right? We see the landowner going out to the place where all these guys looking for a job were standing around, and he says, you, go into my vineyard. And they go. He doesn't say, guys, what are you good at? And do you feel like working today? And is it too hot? Like, it might be a little, would you mind? No, he says, go. You, go into my vineyard. And they go all day long. He says it, they do it. Imagine how our lives would be different if we could be obedient like that. If instead of doing our own will, we did his will. Because what do we do instead? Well, we're mindful of our weakness. And we think to ourselves, he's asking me to do something that I can't do on my own strength, so I don't have to do it. Instead, we remember he is all-powerful. And he knows everything, which means he knows our weakness, and he's nobody's fool. So if he calls us to do something, he's going to help us to do it. I don't have much power. God is all-powerful. You know, if you have a friend who's omnipotent and he offers to help you, you should let him. What else do we know about the Father from this gospel, this parable? Well, he has a plan. Right? He says, you go into my vineyard. Not come along with me and we'll find something for you to do. Not come along with me and, you can do what you want. Go into my vineyard, a very specific type of work. Very careful and complicated type of work to gather the grapes so that they can bear much fruit and bring about this rich product for celebration. You don't want to damage them, or it makes bad wine. So he has a plan, and he shares that plan with the people whom he wants to work with him. How different our life would be if we put our hope in him and his plan. Problem is, he only tells us about it one little bit at a time. He says, go into my vineyard. He doesn't give them the job while they're standing there. He says, come with me, go into my vineyard, and I'll tell you what to do. But we get paralyzed by wondering, who am I, and what's my purpose, and what am I supposed to do? Instead of asking the Lord, who made you, who designed you with a purpose in mind, who put you right where he wants you, with all the people around you that need you and that you need. Imagine how different our lives would be if we just said about every little challenge and every little question, this is the Lord's plan. I don't understand it, but I'm going to follow it because he knows what he's talking about. If you have a friend who is omniscient and he offers you advice, you should take it. What else do we know about the Lord from this parable? He is just. Right? This argument between him and the guys who got hired at dawn. Lord, you're not being fair. You gave them as much as us. What does he say? Well, I made you a promise, and I'm keeping my promise. And he is just. But because we are prideful sometimes, and because we get hurt, and we like to dwell on our hurts, we want justice on our own, right? I'm not going to do anything good because nobody else in society is doing any good. I'm not going to forgive him because he hasn't come and told me that he's sorry. I'm not going to spend any time with her because she's offended me too many times. I'm done. Right? Our desire for justice, to get paid back, to have it figured out, it holds us back. It paralyzes us from living as the Lord would have us live. How different would our lives be if we trusted him to work out justice and we focused on his mercy? Because he's not only just, but he is merciful, out of all proportion to our deserving it. That's what I said to my dad that day that we were talking about this gospel. He says, well, they got more than they deserved, and the guys that started didn't get, it wasn't fair. I said, never ask God for what you deserve. Never ask God to be fair, right? One sin against an infinitely good God is an infinitely bad thing. Thank God that he is not strictly just, but that his justice is tempered with mercy. The prophet says, let him turn to the Lord for mercy, to our God who is generous in forgiving. And the reason that we maybe misinterpret this gospel is because we think of the daily wage in terms of wages and money. It's an amount, no less but no more. That's not how God pays us. It's not who he is. When the Lord rewards us with his mercy, it is infinite. So that when he gives the guys who started late the same as the guys who started early, that's simply to say he gives everybody everything that he has. All of his mercy, all of his love, all of his strength, all of his plan, all of his life. And if we're not living full of his Spirit, it's not because he's rationing it out to us. It's not because his gift is too small. It's because the room that we make to receive it is too small. And so our following of the Lord, our discipleship, it is work. It is a labor, and sometimes we feel like we're bearing the day's burden and the heat to follow him in a world that doesn't know him and doesn't care to know him and doesn't care to make room for people who are striving to be holy. It is work. But when we are stretched by that burden, when we are stretched by the sufferings of life, when we are stretched by the relationships that are difficult, by striving to go out and be generous to people who make us crazy, when we are stretched by the life of discipleship, then the vessel into which we can receive his infinite gift is made larger and roomier, and we are better able to receive what he offers to us. Now, if there's anybody that needs to receive the grace and the strength and the plan and the mercy of the Lord, it's a priest, particularly a parish priest, a pastor. That's why we're here today, to pray with Father McConan and to pray for him, because he is taking on, to an even greater degree than he has already done, this commitment to you and to your lives and to God. When each of you die and stand before the Lord, you have to answer to him for the things you've said and the things you've done. When your pastor dies and stands before the Lord, he's got to answer for the things he said and the things he's done and the way that he served you and the advice that he gave you. He answers for your souls as well as his own. This is a great gift to us, but a great challenge for anyone who would take on this role. So we have to pray for him. The Lord is calling him to lay down his life for you. By the way, I should apologize. I heard some of you coughing before. I like to use a lot of incense. And you know the thing about incense, this particular incense, it's cool. It's actual frankincense. The thing about incense, it doesn't come from here. It comes from Abyssinia, from Ethiopia. And it's brought here, and it's crafted here, and it's put through fire and a heating process, and it's chopped up, and it's packaged up. And then you know what we do? We put it on the fire, and it's burned up as a sacrifice. It's a precious gift, this gift that comes from a world away, from Ethiopia. That's all burned up in the service of the Lord. That's all used up so to help us to pray. And you know I'm not just talking about the incense, right? Your pastor is called to be like that for you. And so you've got to help him to remember what we know about the Lord. You can't do this on your own, but the Lord is all-powerful and wants to help you. You won't know what to do every moment of every day, but the Lord has a plan. Amen. And will always tell you when you pray. You won't be able to settle everybody's disputes or fix everybody's problems, but the Lord is just, and we can hand those things over to him. And you yourself are not perfect, no more than any one of us, but the Lord is merciful, generous and abundant and infinite in his mercy. And he will give you his mercy in abundance because you will be a minister of mercy. You already have been a minister of mercy to so many people. I hope you're all going to confession all the time because this is your way to heaven, this minister of mercy. The Lord has called you into his vineyard, into this particular segment of his vineyard. And sometimes it'll feel like you're bearing the day's burden and the heat. But at the end of each day, if you can tell the Lord, look, I've done everything I could to hear your voice and know your will and carry it out, then with your parishioners you can rejoice in the abundance of his gifts, in the delight of the sacred wine that is drawn from this vineyard, that is transformed into the blood of the Lord who shed his blood for us to give us his help and his mercy and his strength.
Amen.